Through the dense, swirling fog of the Tsushima Strait, 38 Russian warships churned toward their doom. It was May 27, 1905, and the Russian Baltic Fleet had just completed a grueling 18,000-mile voyage spanning 7 months. Hulls fouled with marine growth and crews pushed beyond the brink of exhaustion, they sought only to slip past the Japanese blockade. Instead, they sailed blindly into an execution chamber. Aboard the Japanese flagship, Mikasa, Admiral Tōgō Heihachirō stood impassive on the bridge, processing the wireless intercepts that sealed the fate of the Russian armada. His scout cruisers had shadowed the exhausted fleet since dawn, relaying exact coordinates, speed, and formation data through the mist. Tōgō possessed the ultimate commander's advantage. He knew precisely where his enemy was, while the Russian command remained blind to the steel wall waiting in the fog. At exactly 1:39 in the afternoon, the Japanese fleet executed a maneuver permanently etched into the annals of naval warfare. Tōgō ordered a sharp turn to port, crossing directly in front of the advancing Russian columns. This was the legendary crossing of the T. By exposing his broadsides to the enemy's forward guns for 15 minutes, he positioned his line to unleash unrestricted hell on the Russian vanguard. The resulting barrage was a symphony of concentrated destruction. High explosive shells packed with Shimose powder rained down on the Russian flagship Suvorov, melting steel bulkheads and vaporizing sailors in blinding flashes of yellow flame. The suffocating heat of the explosions turned armored command towers into roaring ovens, stripping away the command structure of the Baltic Fleet in minutes. Men below decks drowned in the dark as the sea rushed through shattered hulls. This slaughter represented the sudden, violent death of an era in naval combat. Admirals had long envisioned fleet engagements as chaotic, close-quarters brawls, relying on mixed batteries to batter enemies into submission. Tsushima obliterated that theory in less than an hour. The Imperial Japanese Navy proved that disciplined, concentrated fire from a distance was the ultimate arbiter of survival. As smoke cleared over the Sea of Japan, geopolitical shockwaves tore through Europe. The annihilation of a major European fleet by an ascending Asian power shattered centuries of imperial assumptions. But in the British Admiralty's hushed map rooms, the focus was not on the Russian Tsar's political humiliation. It was fixated entirely on the terrifying mathematical reality of the gunnery reports. British observers embedded with the Japanese fleet transmitted accounts confirming a horrifying truth for the world's premier maritime power. The standard battleship, armed with 4 large guns and a bristling array of smaller weapons, was fundamentally flawed. At ranges exceeding 6,000 yards, the splash from smaller caliber shells made it impossible to accurately spot and correct the main battery's fire, triggering an immediate crisis within the Royal Navy. If accurate, long-range gunnery was now the supreme tactical advantage. Every battleship afloat in the British fleet was obsolete. Secondary batteries actively hindered the primary weapons. A massive fleet of pre-dreadnoughts, the pride of the British Empire, had been transformed into floating scrap metal in a single afternoon. The response was swift and uncompromising. Under First Sea Lord John Fisher, Britain secretly laid the keel of a revolutionary vessel designed around 2 principles validated at Tsushima: uniform, heavy-caliber armament, and superior speed. Carrying 10 12-inch guns and utilizing experimental steam turbine engines, it could dictate the engagement range and batter adversaries from over the horizon. When HMS Dreadnought launched a year later, it reset both naval engineering and the global balance of power. By rendering previous battleships obsolete, Britain inadvertently leveled the playing field against itself. The massive numerical advantage of the Royal Navy was wiped out overnight. Every industrialized nation now started from zero, sparking an unprecedented arms race. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II seized upon this exact vulnerability. Recognizing a fleeting window to challenge British naval supremacy, German shipyards roared to life, pouring immense national wealth into their own dreadnoughts. This frantic competition poisoned diplomatic relations across the North Sea, transforming a traditional rivalry into an existential standoff that would drag the continent into the abyss, draining treasuries and diverting resources from domestic needs. The cost of a single dreadnought was staggering, consuming vast quantities of steel, coal, capital, and the labor of thousands. Governments justified crushing taxation by pointing to the existential threat of their neighbors, wielding the fear of falling behind as a psychological weapon. While Europe frantically built its steel leviathans, the 1905 clash solidified a new Pacific reality. The destruction of the Russian Baltic Fleet left the Imperial Japanese Navy as the undisputed master of the eastern seas, securing Japan's imperial ambitions in Korea and Manchuria. The victory proved that industrial modernization and ruthless tactical discipline could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Conversely, the Russian defeat exposed the rot at the heart of their imperial command structure. The Baltic Fleet had been plagued by rigid hierarchy, poor training, and a profound lack of initiative among its officers. When the flagship Suvorov fell out of line, burning and crippled, the rest of the Russian vessels simply followed her in a slow, agonizing circle, lacking the standing orders or the tactical flexibility to break formation and fight independently. This catastrophic failure of leadership was meticulously analyzed by naval academies worldwide. The lesson was clear. Advanced technology meant nothing without the operational autonomy to employ it effectively. Japanese captains had operated with a shared tactical doctrine that allowed them to coordinate fire and maneuver without relying on constant flag signals from Admiral Tōgō. This decentralized execution within a unified strategic vision became the new gold standard for naval officer training globally. As the Dreadnought race accelerated, the tactical lessons of Tsushima metastasized into a rigid strategic dogma. The belief in the decisive fleet action, a single apocalyptic clash that would determine the fate of nations in an afternoon, gripped the minds of admirals everywhere. They built massive fleets designed specifically to fight the next Tsushima, pouring national wealth into heavily armored gun platforms intended to line up and trade broadsides across miles of open ocean. This obsession fundamentally altered the diplomatic architecture of Europe. Britain, desperate to secure its imperial lifelines and outpace the German naval buildup, abandoned its traditional policy of splendid isolation. The Royal Navy needed to concentrate its dreadnoughts in the North Sea to counter the German high seas fleet, forcing London to seek strategic partnerships. This necessity drove Britain into the arms of France and, ironically, its former imperial rival Russia, forging the Triple Entente. The psychological burden on the commanders of these new dreadnought fleets was immense. They held the economic survival and the imperial prestige of their nations in their hands. A single miscalculation, an unlucky hit to a magazine, could result in the loss of thousands of lives and the collapse of a national defense strategy. The ships became too valuable, too symbolically important, to be risked in anything less than a guaranteed victory. This created a paralyzing strategic paradox that would define the naval theater of the First World War. The weapons built to execute the next decisive battle were deemed too precious to actually deploy in one. When the Great War finally erupted, the massive dreadnought fleets of Britain and Germany spent the majority of the conflict staring at each other across the North Sea, locked in a tense, silent standoff that mocked the billions spent on their creation. The singular clash at Jutland in 1916 would eventually test these massive fleets, but it ended in strategic ambiguity, lacking the devastating finality that Tōgō achieved. The true legacy of the 1905 victory was not just the ships it inspired, but the global paranoia it unleashed. The destruction of the Russian fleet proved that naval supremacy was fragile, and that technological surprise could erase centuries of maritime dominance in a matter of hours. The ghost of the Baltic Fleet haunted every naval architect and strategist of the 20th century. The fear of being caught with obsolete doctrine drove a relentless pursuit of speed, armor, and gunnery range. The close-quarters brawls of the 19th century were replaced by complex mathematical engagements where ships fired at targets they could barely see, relying on optical rangefinders and mechanical computers to plot the trajectories of massive armor-piercing shells. Even as aviation and submarine warfare began to emerge from the shadows, the Dreadnought remained the ultimate symbol of national power, a direct ideological descendant of the Japanese victory. The realization that control of the seas dictated the survival of empires forced nations to mortgage their futures for steel hulls and heavy guns. The strategic impact rippled outward, dictating the terms of international treaties and shaping the industrial capacity of the modern world. The waters of the Tsushima Strait hold the silent legacy of a moment that fractured history. When Admiral Tōgō Heihachirō ordered his fleet to cross the Russian line, he did more than win a battle. He triggered a chain reaction of industrial militarization that set the world on a direct course for global war. The doctrine shift from chaotic melee to calculated long-range annihilation redefined the mechanics of human conflict, leaving a permanent scar on the 20th century. The decisions made in that fog-shrouded strait remind us that the machinery of war is constantly evolving, often outpacing the strategic comprehension of those who command it. History is shaped by those who recognize the shifting tides of technology before their adversaries do. To continue exploring the unseen forces, the tactical breakthroughs, and the silent legacies that have forged the modern world, don't forget to hit that subscribe button